on the street today, watching a roaring river of Toyota vehicles speed by. You could never imagine that the original driving force behind this global automotive juggernaut, a titan that currently crushes the market and strikes fear into the hearts of century-old European old money and Detroit's industrial behemoths, was simply a young boy at the bottom of the social ladder who wanted to save his mother from bending over so many times. There were no grandiose declarations about changing the world, no glamorous Silicon Valley garage. Toyota's original totem of creation was born from a loom covered in sweat and sawdust. Rewind to rural Japan at the end of the 19th century. This was an era torn apart by cheap, machine-made cotton flooding in from the West. A young carpenter's son named Sakichi Toyoda watched his mother sit every day at a traditional handloom called a takahata, throwing the shuttle by hand, working the heddles with her feet. It was an incredibly tedious and physically exhausting process. Sakichi couldn't stand watching it anymore. He locked himself in a dark, cramped room and went to war with wooden gears. His own father cursed him for neglecting his real work, and the entire village pointed fingers at his back, calling him a madman. But through sheer willpower, wielding a carving knife and raw intuition, he whittled out a Toyota wooden handloom that doubled productivity. But this was merely the beginning of a genius's nightmare. When Sakichi built Japan's first power loom, he caught the eye of the era's all-powerful conglomerate, Mitsui Bussan. Brilliant mechanics are often just meat on the chopping block for ruthless capital. Mitsui locked Sakichi in with funding, then bared the bloodthirsty fangs of capitalism. They wanted to run the machines ragged to squeeze out short-term profits. But Sakichi, an absolute tech fanatic, insisted on pouring every dime earned back into the bottomless pit of a fully automatic loom. When the pure faith of an artisan collided with the greed of capital, the outcome was inevitable. Sakichi was ruthlessly kicked out of the very company he founded. But true beasts never die in the valley. Stripped of his power, Sakichi fled to the United States. Amidst the roaring assembly lines of Ford in Detroit, this down-and-out old man, who had spent his entire life in textiles, stood on the streets of a foreign land and saw right through to the ultimate lifeline of humanity's future. Not cotton, but cars. This humiliation of being ousted by capital laid the deepest, most ruthless groundwork for Toyota's later cross-industry pivot into automobile manufacturing. In 1924, fueled by an almost vengeful obsession, Sakichi staged a hell of a comeback, unleashing an industrial monster that shocked the world: the Type G automatic loom. This wasn't just a tireless machine, it possessed an incredibly sick nervous system. Out of thousands of high-speed shuttling threads, if even a single one snapped, the machine would instantly slam on the brakes and lock up. Never let a single defect flow into the next step. This god-tier feature, known as jidoka, automation with a human touch, literally gave a cold machine a human soul. It completely eradicated inefficient production and laid the absolute foundation for the globally renowned Toyota production system that would one day make even Ford bow its head. Off the back of this tech, Toyota secured its seed capital. But faced with Detroit's river of steel, the so-called textile giant, Toyota, was still nothing but an ant. In the early 1930s, the Japanese auto market was completely dominated by Ford and General Motors. 99% of the cars on the street were American-made. Detroit had even built assembly plants right on Japan's doorstep. And right then, Toyota welcomed its second-generation visionary, Kiichiro Toyoda. In his hands, Kiichiro gripped the 100,000 pounds his dying father Sakichi had scored by selling his loom patents. This was blood money. Amidst the bitter sarcasm of the company's entire executive board, and under the severe suppression of his fiercely shrewd and conservative brother-in-law, Risaburo Toyoda, Kiichiro made an incredibly insane decision: build cars. To Risaburo, the textile business was a cash cow. Challenging mountains like Ford and GM was like taking the family jewels and throwing them into a black hole. But to Kiichiro, without automobiles, the nation's industry would forever be on its knees before the West. Isolated and unaided, Kiichiro ruthlessly carved out a small corner of their highly profitable textile factory warehouse and hung a sign: Automobile Department. This was a do-or-die testing ground for car building. True technological totems are never written in PowerPoint slides. They are forged with calipers, hammers, and pure despair. No tech? Go buy the latest American Chevrolet and tear it into 1,000 pieces. No blueprints? Spread tens of thousands of parts across the floor. Have engineers measure every inch with calipers, and let sheet metal workers hammer it out, strike by strike. The ultimate nightmare came during the casting of the engine's cylinder block. Japan's basic industry at the time was appallingly weak. Steel was as brittle as crackers, and they couldn't even find decent molding sand or binders. When pouring liquid iron at thousands of degrees, the internal mud cores would constantly shatter. The resulting cylinders either leaked like a sieve or were riddled with air holes. This was a completely brutal, bloody campaign of violent reverse engineering. Outside the warehouse, a mountain of scrapped cylinder blocks piled up to 500 or 600 high, an industrial wasteland that would make anyone look at it and despair. Every single day was a cash-burning frenzy. The financial chain could snap at any moment, and his brother-in-law's butcher knife was always ready to drop. During these darkest days, Kiichiro and his workers dragged their bedrolls into the shop, sleeping on the oil-stained floor, blindly testing formulas next to thousands of degree furnaces. After hundreds of cash-burning failures, in 1934, they finally managed to cast an Type A engine that could actually turn over. In 1935, the patched-together Frankenstein Model A one-passenger car was born. But reality instantly slapped Kiichiro across the face. This piece of junk wouldn't sell at all. Staying alive was 10,000 times more important than some so-called passenger car dream. That 100,000 pounds in startup capital was burned to ashes. To survive, Toyota immediately swallowed its pride, threw its ego into the dirt, and pivoted hard to cobbling together the rough-and-tumble heavy transport trucks, the Model G1, that the government and military desperately needed. What if the quality was trash? What if the truck broke down halfway or snapped an axle? Kiichiro's strategy was barbaric, yet deeply humble. Drive out to the middle of nowhere in the dead of night, take a financial loss, swap in a brand new truck. Anything to shut the mouth of a furious customer. Toyota's earliest brand reputation wasn't built on ironclad quality. It was clawed out of the mud through this near begging on their knees style of customer service. And this absolute, poverty-stricken desperation forced the creation of a world-shattering management myth. In the newly built Corolla plant, facing the threat of war and the strangulation of a snapping supply chain, what do you do when you have no money to stockpile parts? Kiichiro issued a brutal directive. Produce only the necessary parts, in the necessary quantities, at the necessary time. This wasn't some elegant, high-level theory taught in a business school. This was the legendary just-in-time manufacturing that the entire global industrial world would later worship. It was a survival talisman forced into existence by severe material shortages, a financial pipeline choked off by brother-in-law Risaburo, and the sheer terror of looming bankruptcy. Toyota had finally found its footing in a pool of its own blood. But they had no idea that a financial massacre, one that would nearly kill the entire company, was staring them down the road. In 1930s Japan, Detroit wasn't just a synonym for industry, it was an absolute religion. Ford and GM cars dominated the streets, projecting the unrivaled dominance of American industrial power to the world. Kiichiro Toyoda was a clear-headed tech maniac. Looking at the cobbled-together Model G1 trucks in his shop, he knew damn well. These industrial half-measures that constantly snapped axles and lost their brakes didn't even deserve to share a stage with the great American cars. He understood tech, but he knew absolutely nothing about how to sell a car. If you don't know, you learn from the ultimate masters. Kiichiro made the smartest and boldest move in early Toyota history. He poached from General Motors. He locked eyes on the top sales executive for GM Japan at the time, Shotaro Kamiya. In a Nagoya restaurant, Kiichiro didn't brag about Toyota's tech. Instead, he laid bare the brutal reality of Toyota teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, alongside his humble vision of building a homegrown auto industry. Kamiya was moved by this burn-the-boats sincerity. He walked away from his sky-high salary and cushy job at GM, jumping onto Toyota's sinking ship as its head of sales. History proves it. Toyota's early life was saved by American business wisdom. The minute Kamiya took office, he copy-pasted GM's advanced franchise dealer system straight into Toyota. Facing clients raging over broken-down cars, Kamiya laid down an absolute iron law. Customer first, dealer second, manufacturer third. If a car broke down in the middle of nowhere, you took a loss and drove the parts out overnight to fix it. Even more revolutionary, Kamiya astutely noticed that the average person couldn't afford to buy a car in cash. In 1935, fighting off heavy opposition, he directly imported the mature American system of auto installment payments, partnering with banks to guarantee loans. This 1-2 punch of modern financial sales, learned straight from Detroit, instantly broke the deadlock and gave Toyota its first breath of life in a market dominated by giants. A lot of people think early Toyota was just assembling cars, but the harsh reality was beyond imagination. Japan at the time had zero right to even talk about a modern automotive supply chain. When trying to clone advanced American engines, Kiichiro despairingly realized Toyota's engines would literally crack wide open while driving, and drive shafts would snap like twigs. The reason was simple. Japanese steel at the time was garbage. Brittle as a cracker, it couldn't handle the violent stress of a high-speed automobile. All the Japanese steel companies were busy serving the military and didn't give a damn about Toyota's pathetic little orders. Pushed into a corner, Kiichiro slammed his fist on the table. If no one will sell it to us, we'll forge the steel ourselves. In 1940, he squeezed a massive chunk of change out of their already strapped funds and built their own specialty steel plant. This would become the world-class steel giant Aichi Steel. Short on precision machine tools? Build an in-house machine tool R&D department, which became global steering system overlord JTEKT. Electronic car parts constantly short-circuiting and catching fire while outside vendors threw their hands up. Do it yourself. He founded an electrical R&D division, which became Denso, the #1 global auto parts giant, standing shoulder to shoulder with Germany's Bosch. The genesis of Toyota is essentially a survival story of being backed into a corner. They didn't just build a car, they were forced, starting from a single grain of iron ore on barren land, to incubate a massive, vertically integrated industrial empire spanning metallurgy, machine tools, and electronics. You think they took off after surviving the startup phase? Dead wrong. The closest Toyota ever came to dying was post-World War II, in 1950. The post-war Japanese economy had utterly collapsed, and hyperinflation was ripping through the country. To curb it, a ruthless financial tightening policy, the Dodge line, was dropped like shock therapy. Market liquidity evaporated instantly. Toyota couldn't sell a single car, inventory stacked up like mountains, and they were bleeding a massive 22 million yen in the red every single month. By early 1950, the money completely dried up. Toyota couldn't even make payroll. Staring down the barrel of bankruptcy liquidation, Kichiro was forced to practically beg a banking syndicate for help. The governor of the Bank of Japan scoffed at Toyota, even making an incredibly arrogant public statement. A resource-poor country like Japan doesn't need its own auto industry. Importing cars straight from America is more than enough. In the eyes of the elite, the great American cars satisfied every need. Toyota had no reason to exist. After agonizing negotiations, the syndicate finally agreed to a lifeline loan, but with savage conditions. Massive layoffs and a mandatory, total split of the manufacturing and sales operations. The layoff order dropped, instantly triggering an unprecedented 2-month mega-strike. Tensions between the union and management reached a boiling point. The factory ground to a halt, and violent clashes were a hair's breadth away. The entire Toyota Motor Corporation had walked right to the edge of the cliff. One more step meant the abyss. At this absolute rock-bottom moment, to quell the chaos and save the automotive empire he had cobbled together with his own hands, the founder, Kiichiro Toyota, made one of the most tragic sacrifices in business history. He took the fall and resigned. He paid the price of his supreme authority to extinguish the workers' fury and secure the bank's lifeline loan. On June 5, 1950, this madman who had burned through his very blood and bone for Toyota Motors quietly walked away from the kingdom he had built with his life. Destiny is as cruel as it is dramatic. Just 20 days after Kiichiro was ousted, a war broke out overseas, the Korean War, bringing in massive U.S. military truck orders. This godsend, a colossal U.S. military procurement, acted like a shot of adrenaline, instantly pulling Toyota back from death's door and reviving the entire factory. But Kiichiro never got to taste this hard-won victory. In 1952, right on the eve of Toyota's brass bringing him back to serve as president, 57-year-old Kiichiro Toyota suffered a sudden cerebral hemorrhage and died. A generational madman fell, but the factory he built with his life had completely rewired its DNA. Next, this industrial beast, having sucked up the nutrients of Detroit and crawled its way out of hell, was about to show the world its truly terrifying ability to learn. Business schools around the globe worship the Toyota Production System, TPS, treating it like some highly refined, elegant philosophy. But few know that standing behind this mythical system was a terrifying tyrant named Taiichi Ohno. On the floor of a Toyota plant, there were no polite, gentle discussions, only absolute, high-pressure stress. Taiichi Ohno had an incredibly sick habit. He would draw a chalk circle on the roaring factory floor. Then, he'd grab a random floor supervisor and issue a death warrant of a command. "Stand in this circle. You don't leave without my permission, and you don't leave until you find the waste on this assembly line." Countless executives stood in that circle for hours, sometimes an entire day, until their legs went numb. If Ohno returned and your answer wasn't deep enough, he would chew you out, scream in your face, and make you stand there again the next day. Through this extreme, almost tyrannical method, he physically burned an absolute hatred for waste right into the muscle memory of every Toyota manager. But the greatest industrial revolutions often draw inspiration from the most unbelievable crossovers. The Kanban system, created by Taiichi Ono, the ultimate secret weapon for achieving zero inventory, wasn't inspired by some complex engineering algorithm. It came from walking into an ordinary American supermarket during a trip to the States. He stood in front of the shelves, mind blown, watching the American stock clerks. A customer bought a bottle of milk, and the clerk precisely replaced one bottle of milk. The shelves were never empty, but they were never overstocked either. His soul was instantly struck by this minimalist, highly efficient American retail model. What if we turned an incredibly complex automotive assembly line into an American supermarket? The downstream process only takes the exact parts it needs from the upstream process, exactly when it needs them. This magnificent crossover homage saved Toyota billions in inventory capital every single year. Toyota, using the wisdom of American retail, completely rewrote the source code of global heavy industry. Fast forward to 1966. Toyota decided to build a true people's car that everyday families could actually afford. This heavy burden was placed in the hands of an engineer named Tatsuo Hasegawa. This guy's background was incredibly hardcore. During World War II, he was a top-tier aerospace engineer designing fighter jets. Everyone assumed he would build a high-speed machine loaded with black magic tech. Instead, Hasegawa dropped a bizarre, counterintuitive philosophy on the automotive world: the 80-point rule plus alpha. He laid down the law to his entire R&D team. This car is absolutely forbidden from scoring 100 points in power, exterior, interior, or chassis. But every single category must hit exactly 80 points. Why? Because chasing a perfect score in any one category would massively drive up the sticker price for regular folks. Everyday families didn't need to race on a track. They needed a commuter tool they could always afford to fix, that would never break down, and that had zero fatal flaws. Being mediocre isn't hard, but being flawlessly mediocre is a monumental task. But built on top of that 80-point foundation, you had to deliver an alpha, a visible, luxurious little surprise. For instance, while every other car in its class used a janky 3-speed transmission, this car came standard with a 4-speed. Where competitors had seats as thin as paper, this car had thick, plush seating. The car named Corolla was born. Test drivers thought it lacked personality. Car critics found it bland. But it was exactly this weaponized mediocrity that swept across the globe like an industrial virus. Everyday people voted with their hard-earned cash because it calculated human nature down to the microscopic level. As of today, total global sales of the Corolla have smashed past 50 million units. It is the highest-selling single industrial product in human history, ruthlessly stepping over Europe's VW Beetle and Golf. It isn't a work of art. It is the ultimate money-printing machine, built on a laser-precise understanding of what ordinary people need. By 1983, Toyota was swimming in cash. Not only did they dominate Japan, but they were crushing it in the US market. Yet, in a late-night, closed-door meeting, Toyota's then helmsman, Eiji Toyoda, threw a soul-piercing question at his executives. If we throw out the budget, if we ignore all current technological limits, can Toyota build the greatest car in the world, one that can genuinely crush the Mercedes S-Class and the BMW 7 Series? Dead silence. Challenging the century-old European old money seemed like a literal suicide mission for a Japanese automaker at the time. But Chief Engineer Ichiro Suzuki stood up. Yes, we can. The ultra-classified Circle F project, later dubbed Project F1, Flagship No. 1, was officially greenlit. This would become the luxury brand that shocked the world: Lexus. The goal Suzuki set for his team was an absolute, sadistic, impossible trinity. Top speed must hit 155 miles per hour, 250 kilometers per hour. Fuel efficiency must be 20% better than its rivals, and cabin noise at 60 miles per hour, 100 kilometers per hour, must be under 58 decibels, something even the big dogs at Mercedes couldn't pull off. Faced with these reality-bending demands, a chassis engineer literally got into a fistfight with Suzuki right in the conference room. For this car, Toyota went completely insane. They dumped an astronomical budget, mobilized 3,900 elite engineers, and built a staggering 450 test prototypes. They hauled these cars to Germany's unrestricted Autobahn, to America's Death Valley, and to the frozen hellscape of the Arctic Circle for brutal testing. Nearly 100 prototypes were smashed into scrap metal in crash tests. To eliminate microscopic engine vibrations, they deployed aerospace-grade metal machining, locking the weight variance of the crankshaft down to within a few measly grams. In 1989, the first-generation Lexus LS400 dropped out of nowhere. To prove its ultimate smoothness to the world, Toyota shot a hardcore commercial that immediately attained God-tier status. On the hood of an LS400, engineers stacked 15 crystal glasses into a towering champagne pyramid. Then, they fired up the engine on a dynamometer and floored it straight to 145 miles per hour, 232 kilometers per hour. On screen, the rear wheels were spinning furiously, the engine letting out a deep, guttural roar. But on that hood, the champagne tower didn't just stand rock solid. There wasn't even a single ripple in the water inside the glasses. The second this no-nonsense, brute force test aired, the entire North American high-end auto market erupted. Wealthy Americans obsessed with the ultimate experience flooded Toyota showrooms, checkbooks in hand. That year, Mercedes' market share in North America fell off an absolute cliff. From that wooden loom built at the end of the 19th century to ease a mother's labor, to a Lexus humming at 145 miles per hour without rippling a glass of water, Toyota has walked a bloody, grueling, and awe-inspiring path to the top. They once shivered before Detroit's river of steel, but they didn't choose arrogant confrontation. They bowed their heads and injected American sales philosophy and supermarket management wisdom straight into their bloodstream. They once resigned in disgrace on the brink of bankruptcy, only to hammer out the world's #1 supply chain system from the ashes. This is no longer just a story of a Japanese company getting rich. It is the ultimate industrial epic of how humanity confronts technological walls, how to survive in the face of absolute despair, and how to never, ever stop evolving.